Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Ignite Faith podcast, where we explore God's Word that's like fire. I'm John, and it's going to be just me this time. I'm not joined by my lovely wife, Devin, and that's because this time I'm doing a slightly different kind of episode. Devin will be back with me for the next one, when we start doing John chapter 4 in a verse-by-verse study. What I'm doing this time is kind of somewhat of a personal interest for me. I'm actually going to cover on this episode 16, which is part 15 of our verse-by-verse Bible study of the Gospel of John. I'm actually going to do some background and historical context on the people of Samaria and their relationship with the Jewish people. So we're going to cover a little bit of geography, trying to understand kind of where Samaria is in relation to the rest of the surrounding region, some historical context for why Samaria and the Jews don't like each other, some interesting archaeology, or at least what I think is interesting, and just some general learnings that I had through this process that I found really helpful. And the reason I want to do this is, one, it's just good to slow down and try to understand the context of which everything was kind of written when these things took place. To really get the fullness out of the Bible when you study it, you need to try to understand as best we can the culture and the times in which it was written. Now, the ancient Near East, that culture doesn't exist anymore, and there's a lot of little things that we probably miss out on due to this. There are aspects and details that might pop out and be really significant to the readers of John's time, and yet some of those things aren't nearly as obvious to us 2,000 years later. So, for an example, throughout the New Testament, we hear, 3 days and 3 nights. It's actually in the Old Testament as well, but you hear kind of, I'll fast for 3 days and 3 nights. Or Jesus was dead in the tomb for 3 days and 3 nights. Well, that's actually a Jewish idiom. It doesn't literally mean 3 24-hour periods like it sounds. But it just meant something spanned over 3 days. And if it included any part of a day, then it was counted. So, when I was growing up, that would confuse me a little bit and Jesus was dead for 3 days, but if he died on a Friday and rose on a Sunday, rose on a Sunday, then that's not 3 24-hour periods. And I'd kind of wonder, how that language was being used. And so when that's a figure of speech, it kind of makes it make more sense. And so as we're trying to go deeper into the Bible, do verse-by-verse study, it's good when you have questions to just take a few minutes and slow down. And I had questions. As I studied John 4, we get a little bit in John 4 around, the fact that Jesus has to go through Samaria to get to Galilee. And we get in verse 9 of chapter 4, just kind of a quick statement by John that says, "For Jews do not associate with Samaritans." And the whole first half, actually I think it's more than the first half, of John 4 takes place in Samaria. And there's a lot of background and context between the Jewish people, the Samaritans, a long history of hatred that is kind of being battled here and going on. If you know some of that, I think it actually helps the story of this woman at the well and the salvation that comes to this village of Samaria. I mean, it makes it seem even more amazing than it already was. And so it's I'll use an analogy of kind of like making a really good stew. You can make a really good stew by pretty fast. You add your broth, your ingredients, you kind of simmer it or you cook it, and you can have a great meal. And you can do that with our Bible study in John 4 without listening to this episode. If you're not super interested in the deep background on Samaria and these relationship problems, you can still be perfectly fine just going to the next episode and enjoying the verse-by-verse study. But when you do spend extra time, like you would like on a stew, letting it simmer, letting it take a lot longer, getting it more rich, more deep in flavor, you get an even better meal. And that's kind of what I'm trying to do here is we go deeper into our Bible study, we spend more time on it, our theology gets deeper, it gets more enriched, and you'll probably enjoy it even more. And even though the other version's still good, it's just that this version could be better. So, if this kind of topic doesn't really interest you, no worries. Feel free to skip on to the next episode where we'll pick up the verse-by-verse study going into John 4. But what I thought was, so I mentioned earlier, in John 4:9, John just tells us that Jews don't associate with Samaritans. So my question there is, why not? In Luke 10, verses 25 through 37, Jesus tells a parable about a good Samaritan. And he intentionally uses a Samaritan in that story to try to make a point. And so we kind of see different little angles of it throughout the New Testament, but not necessarily a lot more. And so a couple things I want to go through. I'm going to start with some just geography about this topic and how that kind of plays in to what's going on in John 4. So Samaria itself is both the name of a region and a specific city, which always gets confusing when you're looking at that kind of stuff in the Bible. However, in Jesus' time, the city wasn't called Samaria anymore. The city that had been known as Samaria had been renamed. So one of the Herods refortified Samaria somewhere around like 30 to 22 BC and renamed it to Sebast as like an honor to Emperor Augustus. Emperor Augustus kind of put him in charge of this area, and this particular Herod decided to build the city back up, rename it in honor of the emperor, and so now it has a new name. But in Jesus' time, when they say Samaria, they're talking about the region. They're talking typically about it's a hilly region that's north of Jerusalem. And the village that they actually visit is called Sychar. It's a specific village that Jesus and his disciples visit in John 4. And the village itself was probably very close to ancient Shechem. There are some who think that Sychar actually was Shechem and that the name just changed at some point. But there are also a lot of historians that don't feel that way. So you might just see some different opinions on that if you go look it up. But to understand a little bit of what's going on in John 4, in John 4, verse 3, it talks about that he leaves Judea and wanted to go to Galilee. And in verse 4, he had to travel through Samaria. So let's dig into that a little bit from a geography perspective. So Jerusalem is like all the way in the south in a region called Judea. So the racial and religious Jews lived generally in one of two areas. They lived in the south in Judea, or they lived in the north in Galilee. And smack dab right in the middle of them is Samaria. So if ancient Israel was a sandwich, Jerusalem or like Judea, that region would be like the bottom piece of bread. Galilee in the north would be the top piece of bread, and Samaria would be the turkey, bacon, and cheese, or whatever else you like to put on a sandwich. And so you have to imagine here a large group of people that you hate as a Jewish person basically live the next town over in a really inconvenient spot that makes it hard for you to travel and visit, your Jewish brethren. And, modern day, we can get around this kind of stuff pretty easy. We can just drive. We might drive a few miles out of our way to go around something, but it wasn't nearly as easy for them back then. So in verse 3, where he left Judea and went up to Galilee. So there were two paths they would typically go by. There's a shorter path that was straight north, directly through Samaria. And that was the faster route. It was probably close to about 65 to 75 or so miles. And that could be done in about 3 days. So if you were willing to go through Samaria and pass through the Samaritan villages or towns, it was a lot faster to go that way, whether you're going from Galilee down south or going from Jerusalem up north to Galilee. But then there's a much longer path. And the longer path is actually the one that your average Jewish person would take. Like if they were traveling down to Jerusalem for like the Passover or traveling back home after the Passover feast was done, the longer path was closer to about 80 to 100 miles, depending on exactly kind of where you started and where you were going to. And this was more of like a 5 to 7 day journey. And it basically went around the outskirts of Samaria. So they would actually, if they were starting in Jerusalem, instead of heading north, they would head 90 degrees and go east. They'd cross over the Jordan River, then go north, past Samaria, and once they were kind of past that region, they would head west again, back over the Jordan River, and, kind of go from there. So they would take literally like double the amount of time to get where they're going just to bypass Samaria. And that's a pretty big deal. So we'll talk about this more the next episode when we do the verse by verse study, but in John 4:4 it says he had to travel through Samaria. Well, not logistically, he didn't. He didn't have to go through Samaria. He could have gone the long route around Samaria, but Jesus had to go to Samaria. Not because the road dictated that he did, but because Jesus had a mission to do. And so I don't want to spoil too much for next episode, so we'll get into that a little bit more, but kind of going back to the main point. Jews and Samaritans, they do not like each other. There's a very long history of dislike, and we get some of that from the New Testament, but let's go a little bit deeper. So, doing some research, here's kind of the main few reasons I found that, why I think there was so much animosity between these two groups of people. And we'll go into each one in a little bit more depth. I'm just going to go ahead and list them off really quick. The first is just the existence of the Samaritan people themselves. This was a racial issue. These are the mixed race descendants of Jewish people from the 10 tribes of Israel from the northern kingdom after many, many years of intermarrying with Gentiles who ended up occupying the area after they were exiled. On top of this, having this kind of racial issue started to bleed into like theological disputes. There's a lot of paganism and incorporation of idolatry within the Samaritan practices, which just deepened the divide. So that's number 2. The third item I had is that there are a lot of prominent biblical moments that happened in or around Samaria, and I have to imagine that some of this probably stung a little bit given the divide between them. And you're already kind of at odds with these people, and now some really important places of your history are kind of off limits to you. I think that had to rub people the wrong way. And then through all that tension, kind of through all the stuff that they have to make them kind of not like each other, then they just have a very long history of actively doing things to hurt each other, actively kind of rebuking each other or causing problems for the other one, which is only going to make things worse. So when you compound that over hundreds and hundreds of years, you're going to get to a point where you just really don't like each other very much. So let's talk a little bit about that first point. The Samaritan people, who are they? The short answer, which I kind of already said, but I'll restate it. They were the mixed race descendants of the Jews of the northern kingdom and Assyrian Gentiles that settled into the land during the period of exile. So, I'm not sure how well you remember your Old Testament history, but we're going to touch on it a little bit here for this to make sense. So the nation of Israel is divided into two kingdoms. This happens somewhere around 936 BC, after the end of King Solomon's reign. The capital of the northern kingdom was at a city called Shechem. And there's a lot of history here. But the capital gets moved to another city called Tirzah. Hopefully I said that right. And this is all done by a king named Jeroboam, who reigned from around 931 to 910 BC. Now, he's a terrible king. He doesn't obey God. He's considered incredibly idolatrous. And you can read a lot about him in 1 Kings. I think it's 2 kings later, there's King Omri. He begins his reign around 882 BC, and you can read more about him. It's 1 Kings chapter 16. He moves the capital from Tirzah. He establishes the city of Samaria. He buys this hill called Samaria, builds a city there, and makes that the capital. It's a very strategic point. It's in a very good spot where, based on like the hills that it sat on, how it let them see the overall land, it had incredible strategic value, especially at a period of time where they were fighting a lot of other people. But he follows in kind of the footsteps of Jeroboam, continues to do what's evil in the Lord's sight, and it continues to cause problems. Then you get King Ahab. He's the son of Omri, which you probably heard of Ahab because he's the one that's married to Jezebel. If you think about the stories of Elijah and like the showdown on the mountain, right? This is King Ahab. He did what was evil even more than all of the other kings before him. And you can read about him a little bit more here. It's 1 Kings 16, 29 through 33. He builds an altar to Baal in like this capital city of Samaria. There's a palace that's inlaid with ivory, and from an archaeological standpoint, I think we've actually found this palace, which is pretty cool. But you know, they have this long history of committing idolatry and kind of turning away from God. And so what happens? The Assyrians are at war with the northern kingdom, and eventually they win. So around 722 BC, Samaria falls to the Assyrians. And if you read 2 Kings chapter 17, verses 5 through 8, basically states that God allows Assyria to conquer the northern kingdom. And so what they would do, this is a really common Assyrian practice. You can read it in 2 Kings 17, verse 24. They would bring people from their own empire or kingdom in to settle the land. So they would take all the Jews or whatever land they conquered, they would deport a lot of them out of their land and replace them with inhabitants from all over their kingdom. And they would scatter the people. So in this case, the Jewish people, the people who were like exiled out of the city, are spread out amongst the kingdom of Assyria to basically break up their cultural identity and kind of make them intermix with the rest of the empire. But then they bring in a whole bunch of other people from Assyria to resettle the land, and some Israelites were allowed to stay. Probably a good bit. Don't know exact numbers here, but the Samaritans emerge from this. So you have, centuries of people who were Jewish now living in the same land with all these Assyrians who come in, and they start to intermarry. They have children, their children have children, and over time you end up with a race of people who supposedly claims still a connection with Israel, and yet from like a Jewish point of view, they would be highly Gentile. And so that started causing a rift. Basically a group of Gentiles claiming to still be Israelites. They still claim themselves to be children of Abraham. They still trace their lineage back through Joseph. So that by itself was an issue. If you kind of read between the Old and New Testament, the way the Jewish people felt about Gentiles, basically they had no love for these Samaritan people, And then to make it worse, they were also claiming to still be Israelites. Now, with that, you start getting a theological divide. This is kind of that second point. There's a lot of idolatry in Samaria, and there's a lot of rejection of Scripture, and there's arguments over the right place to worship God. So while they had this historical connection to Israel in the northern kingdom, they also incorporate a ton of pagan practices and idolatry into the teachings of Moses. So they kind of had this blend of religious practices, and it also talks about that a little bit in 2 Kings 17, verses 24 through 41. It mentions the Assyrians coming in, but then God sends lions into the land and it kills some of them. So the king of Assyria says, hey, we need to bring back a priest that was deported to teach all the new locals how to worship the God of this land. So they add worship to the true God, the only true God, but they also continue worshiping all their other false idols and gods. So, like in verse 41, it says of that 2 Kings 17, they feared the Lord, but also served their idols. Their children, their grandchildren continue to do just as their ancestors did. So they incorporate worship to the only true God, but they don't give up worship of all their other false gods. They just kind of would go into a new region and say, okay, we need to learn who do they worship, incorporate it so that we don't offend the local God, as if there's gods over each region. And that's kind of how they operated. Now with that, over time, there's accusations they outright revised some of the scripture, some of the writings, but they definitely rejected a lot. So they basically only accepted the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible as scripture. They reject all the writings of the prophets. So they're really just supposedly adhering to the writings of Moses. And with the disputes that leads to, over time, they end up building their own temple to worship God on Mount Gerizim. And they either modified scripture or took liberal interpretation of scripture to try to justify this, saying, no, this is the actual place we're supposed to worship God. It's not actually supposed to be in Jerusalem like the Jews think. And, there's some conflicting accounts here on timing. Some accounts have the temple being built maybe around 330 BC, which would be about the time of Alexander the Great. Others put it a little bit older, around 450 BC. But basically, they built their own temple, and they insisted that this is where Moses actually designated the capital and the place of worship. Now, we'll get into a little bit more about the temple in a little bit, but given some of the divide here and the general dislike, the third thing that stood out to me was that there are a lot of really important events in Jewish history that take place in Samaria. So I have to believe there was some deeper Jewish tension with Samaritans just due to the fact that there's historical significance of things in Samaria, primarily around Shechem. And so there's some notable events with the patriarchs, and really just important to their history, that was probably very deeply rooted into their identity as the people of God. So I'm just going to go through a couple of those. The first mention that we have of Shechem is in Genesis 12. This is actually where Abram received God's promise for the land that would belong to his descendants. And that's in Genesis 12, 6 through 7. Now, Shechem itself, it's mentioned a lot throughout the Old Testament especially. It served as a Levitical city of refuge. You can find that in Joshua 21. Joseph's remains, the patriarch Joseph, his remains are actually buried there. That's in Joshua 24. It served as the capital of the northern kingdom, like I mentioned a little while ago. This is also where Joshua. Joshua renews the covenant at Shechem. So after they've wandered the wilderness and they're getting ready to actually go into the promised land, they have this rereading of the covenant. And there's this whole ceremony for it in Joshua 24. And actually where the famous line you've probably heard, As for me and my family, we will worship the Lord. As Joshua 24, verse 15 happens here at Shechem. And so Shechem sat between these two mountains, Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. In Deuteronomy 27, it talks about God commanding the tribes of Israel to stand on each mountain to deliver blessings and curses before entering the promised land. They were supposed to build these altars here with like monuments to the words of the law. So like this is a really important site. Joshua renewing the covenant here. They had this huge ceremony. I mean, this is a big deal. And Mount Gerizim became known as the Mount of Blessing. And this is actually somewhere that Jacob builds an altar in Shechem and calls it Mighty God of Israel. I can't quite pronounce the Hebrew there, so I'm not going to try, but translated Mighty God of Israel. And you can read about that in Genesis 33. But imagine, your primary patriarch, Abraham, from whom they believe that they will be counted as righteous. They're being told this land forever will belong to you and your descendants. And now there's these people who occupy it that represent a totally perverted version of your people and your faith. And imagine you don't even want to visit this place anymore, like where Joshua renewed the covenant, because there are people there who've made it so bad. Now, I'm not saying the Jews are right in this, or the Samaritans are blameless either. There's a lot of hatred there, which is not right. But just trying to help you understand the context and things to be thinking about when it came to their relationship with each other. And then, with all that tension, there's just a history of bad blood then between these two groups. So after the northern kingdom is exiled by Assyria. Later, like 100 years, 150 years, something like that, the southern kingdom, the same thing happens to them, but by Babylon. The difference being Babylon, when they deport the Jews, they don't force them to kind of split up and separate amongst the kingdom. A lot of them are able to stay together and kind of maintain their identity, like as a people, as a culture. And so what we get in Ezra, they're starting to come back. They're coming back and they're starting to rebuild the temple. And so in Ezra chapter 4, verses 1 through 5, it actually talks about how Samaritans offer to come help rebuild the temple. They say, and I'm kind of paraphrasing here, we also worship your God, and we've been sacrificing to him. But in verse 3, they say, look, the heads of the Israeli families answer them, you may have no part in building the temple for us, our God. They're kind of telling them, this isn't all of our God collective. This is still the Jewish God. You will have no part in doing this for our God, not your God. And, at that point, the Samaritans then make it harder. They start getting in the way. They could have just taken the L on this situation and gone home and not worried about it. But instead, the very next verse, Ezra 4:4, the people in the land, the Samaritans, then discouraged the people of Judah and made them afraid to build. Now, if you keep reading verses 6 through 16, it talks about the Samaritans writing petitions to the king and basically tell the king that, hey, look, the Jewish folks are rebellious. They cause nothing but trouble. And if you look at all your historical records, you'll see they're rebellious. They don't pay their taxes. They won't pay their tributes. You really shouldn't trust them to be down here rebuilding. And in verses 17 through 23 of that chapter, the king replies and actually puts a temporary halt on the reconstruction. It says, yeah, I do see the Jewish people have had a long history of rebellion. Now work obviously does resume later, but just kind of showing a pattern here of the Jewish people making progress and then constantly getting kind of threatened or intimidated by the Samaritans who were trying then to prevent the temple from being rebuilt after they were rejected from being able to help with it. And Nehemiah, same thing happens with rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. In Nehemiah 6, verses 1 through 14, it actually describes how there are rumors that were being started that the Jews were rebuilding the wall only so they could rebel against the king. And they're trying to intimidate Nehemiah. They're trying to discredit him. They're even saying, like, we know you've installed prophets that are going to name you king, and are threatening that they're going to tell the king about all of this, to get them in trouble. And then in Nehemiah 13, verses 28 through 29, we have this like return to like the Jewish people really trying to honor the covenant and strictly adhere to it. And that causes even more friction with Samaria. Basically, they're on a mission to restore Judah to practicing the commands of the covenant. Basically said, look, our ancestors, they broke the covenant over and over again, and that's why God was mad. That's why God brought disaster upon us. So now we're going to honor this thing to the fullest. We're going to do our best. And in chapter 13, like Nehemiah is going around and making sure that people are tithing, that they're bringing their offerings because the Levites were having to go work in the fields because they didn't have the things that they needed. And he's rebuking people for dishonoring the Sabbath. He's shutting down all the trade on that day. He's posting guards and closing the city gates. He sees intermarrying happen. And in verse 26 of Nehemiah 13, he says, didn't even Solomon struggle with this sin with foreign women? Like, basically, what are you guys doing? In verse 25, he says he rebukes, curses, beats, and pulls out the hair of some of the men for doing this. There's even a grandson of the priest, like the high priest that they put in. His grandson marries a governor of Samaria. It says he had become son-in-law to Sanballat the Horonite. And Nehemiah drives him out of Jerusalem, like kicks him out. It doesn't say much more about that, it just drives him out. But you have this immediately, like once they're all back together in the same region, it's, a little bit of offering to help, rejection, and now constant kind of bickering and fighting. Then this next part will require a little bit of history we'll go into, but the Jews actually end up destroying the temple that was built at Mount Gerizim. Now, this happens a lot later. This happens approximately around 110 BC. What happened leading up to this point is that after the death of Alexander the Great, his empire is divided up to like 4 of his generals. One of those empires was called the Seleucid Empire. Now, over time, they have several leaders. There ends up being a leader of this empire whose name is Antiochus IV Epiphanes. And you can basically think of him as Old Testament Hitler. He persecuted the Jews extremely bad. He hated the Jews. He loved all things Greek. He basically tried to force all Greek religion down the Jewish people's throats and made it as illegal as possible to be Jewish. They had laws like, if you circumcise your baby, we will kill the baby and the family. So, like a command that they were supposed to do, circumcising the baby on like the 8th day, if I remember right, now they can be put to death just for doing something as basic as that as part of their Jewish custom. They basically rededicated temples to Zeus. He ends up desecrating the Jewish temple and puts a statue of Zeus up in it. And they would go around and try to force all the Jewish people to bow down and sacrifice to false idols and false gods. And you actually end up with this revolt called the Maccabees Revolt, which happens around like 167 to 160 BC. It's led by, I can't remember the father's name, but basically the Greeks come around, the Seleucids come around trying to make them bow down to foreign like pagan idols, and he says no. And they end up killing some of the other Jews in the village who actually did worship these idols, and then kill some of the Seleucid officials. They run off into the mountains and they launch like a guerrilla warfare tactics on the Seleucids for the next few years. And eventually Antiochus dies, and kind of after that, the Jews are able to successfully overthrow the Seleucids, and they actually end up in this period of around like 80 years or so of like self-rule. It's the first self-rule they've had since they've been exiled by Babylon. And so in this kind of period of self-rule, kind of what I was talking about with Nehemiah, they basically start saying we have to be our best. We have to be our most religious. We have to really adhere to the commands of God so that God doesn't take this away from us like he did last time. And so around 110 BC, the leader of this kind of self-ruled Israel, John Hyrcanus, I hope that's right, Hyrcanus. I'm probably butchering names. I apologize. Leads the Jewish people in and say, hey, we're going to destroy your temple. It's not right. You're not worshiping God the right way. Also, the Samaritans kind of supported Antiochus and the Seleucids. Josephus, the historian, records that they basically wrote the Seleucids and said, hey, please don't lump us in with our Jewish brethren. We're not like them. We're more than happy to be Greek. We're more than happy to worship Zeus. You can rededicate our temple. We'll do all the stuff you want. And, Josephus would be a bit of a biased source for that. But at the same time, it's factual that the Samaritans were not persecuted like the Jews were. And I think it's Josephus that makes the claim that basically the Samaritans claimed Jewish ancestry when it was beneficial, and then avoided it whenever it was detrimental, which definitely, is not something that the Jewish people would have liked. So kind of the last two things here, and we'll wrap up. A little bit of a modern archaeology perspective. In John 4, it mentions Jacob's well. And that was also kind of like that, and, why did the Samaritans and Jews hate each other were kind of two things on my mind. Well, that well actually still exists today, and we know exactly where it is. It sits just south of a small village today called Eskar. It lies actually within a church monastery complex of an Eastern Orthodox church. It's located in the Palestine West Bank, near the ancient ruins of Shechem, and it's universally recognized by all these religious groups as being Jacob's well. It's the Christians, Jews, Muslims, and modern-day Samaritans. There actually are still people there today. I think they number in the few hundred that are modern-day Samaritans who also recognize this as Jacob's well. And we even have a pilgrim account from 330 AD identifying this as Jacob's well. The other item I was looking at was the temple at Mount Gerizim. There were archaeological digs carried out by Yitzhak Magen from 1982 to 2006, which have confirmed the existence of this Sumerian temple on Mount Gerizim. Now, some debate, I think I mentioned earlier, as to exactly when it was built. I think there's some sources that put it back around 450 BC, then possibly being expanded during the Hellenistic period around 200 BC. Others say it was probably built in 330 during Alexander the Great's time, because there are a lot of Greek and Hellenistic pottery that's been discovered, and those dates would be closer to the 200s. But to me, that just proves the temple was in use. My house can be built 100 years ago, but I can have brand new furniture and decorations in it. But I'm sure there's more to it than just that. I kind of tend to lean closer to the 450 time, because that kind of matches up with the disputes between the Samaritans and the Jews and Ezra and Nehemiah, and them kind of going off from that point and building their own temple. I think that would make a lot of sense. But, lastly, here's a couple things I'll touch on is just some unexpected things I learned trying to go into this topic. It just started off very simple of I just want to know more about why do the Jews and Samaritans hate each other so much? Why is this such a big deal in the Bible? And what I ended up stumbling upon through all this study was actually context for the rise of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So I've kind of mentioned it twice, and 3 times the charm here, I guess, but I mentioned it in Nehemiah, and in that period of self-rule, there's this kind of shift to taking up extreme religious piety to not repeat the mistakes of their ancestors. And so they really dug in with this devotion to the law to try to prevent these kind of issues from occurring. And it's during this period of self-rule that would have given rise to the Pharisees, to the Sadducees, to these people who know the law to the fullest extent and basically codify every little thing to say, we want to do our best to not disobey God So we have to know it. We have to memorize it. We have to have people in position that can like police and hold people accountable for breaking the Sabbath or doing things they're not supposed to do, so that so that they don't get displaced yet again. It actually made me a bit more sympathetic, I guess, to the Pharisees and Sadducees, because like it's kind of easy to forget when you flip from, I think it's Micah, when you flip that page from the Old to the New Testament, you're flipping about 400 years in time. And there's a reason why the Pharisees came into existence in the first place. Now, yes, they do a lot of things wrong. They definitely, Jesus had legitimate critiques for them. But it just makes a bit more sense to me now how they could get to the point that they did. Like, I feel like that just makes more sense to me. And I wasn't expecting to find that when I started down this trail. I learned there's still Samaritans today. It's a very small group, but they still claim the same ancestry all the way back through Joseph. And it did force me to look at geography and just some like archaeology, and I thought that was kind of cool. Learning some of the important sites where things happened. It's a lot happens in the Old Testament. You hear Shechem or these mountains. There's these places I've never been to. I can't really picture exactly where they are. So sometimes the events, don't stick because you don't really have a frame of reference for where they happened. And I feel like I have a better sense of some of that now, and I think that's a good thing. And, the archaeology thing, the last thing I'll kind of say here is, one thing I really love about archaeology when it comes to the Bible is that archaeology confirms the Bible over and over again. There has never been an archaeological discovery that has contradicted something in the Bible. There are many things that we don't have archaeological evidence for that are in the Bible, that we either haven't found yet or have been destroyed to a point that there's nothing left. Like there's complaints that there's not a lot of archaeological evidence to support the Exodus, but that's kind of a different topic for a different day. But I would argue a lot of that either has just been fully destroyed or just hasn't been found yet. But there's not evidence to say it didn't happen either. And it doesn't mean there's no evidence to support it. It just means there's not necessarily a ton in like specific areas that people are looking for. But it really helps reaffirm our faith a little bit when you see that time and time again, this is a real history. These are real events. These are real people. These things really actually happened. Just like the life, crucifixion, and resurrection of Jesus. It's a real event. It's not a story. It's not a metaphor. It's not allegory. It literally happened. And Jesus came. He lived a perfect life. He was crucified. He died. And on the third day, he was raised from the dead. That is a real life historical event that we actually do have tons of like evidence for. But when you can see that time and time again, that we have archaeological evidence for things of the Bible, I think this helps us be a little bit more confident and, just kind of improve our faith a little bit to help us better trust God and know that, He's in control of all things. So anyway, I hope this is helpful. Some interesting stuff, I thought anyway. If you're like me, you ask some of these questions and you like going really, really deep. And I guess part of the benefit of having a podcast is you can kind of do this stuff when you want to and go a little bit deeper. So I'm grateful for that. But that is everything I have for this episode. Next episode, we're going to be getting into John 4 with verse-by-verse Bible study, starting to really, really get into the story of the woman at the well. It's a great story. All scripture's fantastic, but I think there's just a lot of really, 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 really good stuff to dive into soon. So I hope this is helpful, and I'll catch you next time. God bless.